The Manson family, the Jonestown Massacre, Nexium, the Waco Siege, and countless others. Time and time again, we are exposed to the damage cults cause and the tragic outcomes their fanatical ideologies lead to. And time again, we try to frame the people who fall for them in as imperceivable of a manner as possible. For a long time, the worst incident on the very abridged list mentioned above, the Jonestown Massacre, was widely referred to as a mass suicide, despite surmounting evidence to the contrary. As Tim Reiterman states in the 2008 preface to his 1982 book, Raven, The Untold Story of Reverend Jim Jones and His People, what happened in Jonestown amounted to mass murder, not mass suicide. Jones put all the pieces in place for a last act of self-destruction, then gave the order to kill the children first, sealing everyone's fate. And yet, people chose to portray and perceive their tragedy as a choice, one that you would obviously never be naive enough to make for yourself. Painting tragic events of that magnitude as easily avoidable mistakes that were within the victim's command allows us a measure of distance. It allows us to maintain the illusion of complete control over our fate. It allows us to cling to rationality and pretend like we could never be influenced in that way. We're too smart and logical to fall for it like they did. But humans are fundamentally emotional beings. We are influenced by our feelings, inherent biases, egos, and past life experiences, and nothing is truly as objective as we like to paint it out to be. We refuse to acknowledge how vulnerable we are to suggestions, but denying something doesn't make it any less accurate. Some of our vulnerabilities may be a little more guarded, making them harder to target, but that doesn't mean they're not there. We all have an Achilles heel. Anyway, let's talk about anime. Death Note is a Japanese manga series that ran from 2003 to 2007, written by Tsugumi Oba and illustrated by Takeshi Obata, that was then adapted into a wildly successful anime by the same name in 2006. And Midsommar is not an anime and has nothing to do with Death Note. Midsommar is a 2019 horror film starring Florence Pugh, written and directed by Ari Aster, fresh of the success of his 2018 horror film, Hereditary. Okay, so after that incredibly bleak introduction from earlier, I'm gonna be focusing on these two. I believe these two pieces of media managed to affect many people in a way that illustrates our lack of objectivity and how that influences our rationality and moral fabric. Or it could just be that I really like them. And this was all just an excuse to talk about them for a while. I don't know, but let's find out. I will start by summarizing both stories' broad strokes so that we have a baseline to work from before I go off the deep end and start rambling about like how we're all cult targets and stuff. And when I say summary, I really mean a summary. Like a very brief one. I will be skipping many points that don't pertain to the discussion, especially for Death Note because that's 12 books and I've read them like 3 times and I still discover new stuff I had entirely forgotten about every time I reread. So I'm keeping this brief for like my own sanity. That said, there will be spoilers for Death Note and Midsommar from this point on. Midsommar follows 20-something-year-old psychology grad student Danny, who is subjected to a hefty dose of trauma right as the movie opens when her sister kills their parents and herself in a murder-suicide after sending Danny a cryptic goodbye email and then cutting off all contact. The emotional impact of the trauma seems to put a strain on her already tense relationship with her boyfriend Christian. An anthropology grad student who appears to have already been on the verge of ending his relationship with Danny before this tragedy occurred. Is anthropology the right term? Because that's a store. Clothing retail company. No, it is. Danny eventually discovers that Christian and his friends had plans to go to Sweden to attend an almost centennial midsummer celebration at Christian's friend Pele's ancestral commune in the Harga. Josh, another of Christian's friends, is especially invested in this trip as he believes it would provide an invaluable research opportunity for his thesis. That discovery leads to an argument between Danny and Christian, which ends with Christian reluctantly inviting Danny to come along. However, despite the invitation, which Danny accepts, it appears that Pele is the only person genuinely excited about Danny joining them. After a long trip, they arrive near the rural commune, where they meet Connie and Simon, 2 other visitors whom Pele's communal brother invited. Upon their arrival, the visitors are immediately offered psychedelic mushrooms, which they take. Here we see Danny's drug trip, mainly from her perspective, which allows us to witness her trauma manifesting itself through visual hallucinations, making its continued presence in her subconscious visible to the audience. Very soon after they get there, the visitors are tricked into witnessing the cult's very violent death ritual. One of the community's beliefs is that life ends at the age of 72. So when the elderly members of the cult reach that age, they participate in what appears to be a ritualistic death ceremony, where they jump off a very high cliff while everyone watches and shares in their pain by echoing their cries of agony back to them. Considering what she has just gone through, this has a lot of emotional impact on Dani, which is evident as we see her immediately start packing to leave. That's when Pele comes in and tries to talk her into seeing the positive side of how the cult deals with and accepts death as a part of life instead of locking their pain up. Dani appears placated for the moment, but Connie and Simon, who were similarly incensed, were not given a convincing speech like Dani, so they remain adamant in their decision to leave. However, there are weird circumstances surrounding their departure. Simon appears to have left without Connie, who quickly tries to follow him in distress, and the whole ordeal just has a sinister feeling. In the midst of all this, Christian seems to have also realized what an excellent research opportunity this is for an anthropology student and decides to make his thesis on the Harga too, much to Josh's chagrin. Everything to do with this guy's name is so hard to say. Much to Josh's chagrin, who then insinuates that this is a pattern of behavior for Christian, and a small argument ensues. That night, possibly influenced by the emergence of unanticipated rivalry, Josh decides to take his research to the next level. He sneaks out in the middle of the night to take pictures of the Harga's sacred text, despite being explicitly forbidden from doing that by a commune elder. He's then caught and immediately attacked by someone who appears to be wearing their other friend Mark's face, which is a really creepy sentence. The next day, Dani and Christian are the last ones standing, unbeknownst to them. They are both separately given a hallucinogenic drink, and Dani is talked into taking part in the women's dance competition for the title of May Queen. Dani wins the coveted title and is immediately bombarded with love and cheers. Almost simultaneously, Christian appears to be participating in his own ritual, a mating one. Christian's involvement here does appear more coerced though. Christian is lured into a pre-planned mating ritual with one of the young female members of the Harga, one who's had his attention since their arrival. Christian was definitely drugged before this though. Dani ends up seeing this and in response has a panic attack, but she's helped through it by the other female commune member she has just been dancing with. Following that, Christian tries to take off, but instead stumbles upon what appears to be Josh's leg sticking out of a flower bed. And then he finds Simon's body, then he's attacked and paralyzed by someone. It is then explained that during every Midsommar festival, the cult has to offer 9 human sacrifices. 4 from outside the commune, 4 from within it, and the last one is picked by the May Queen. Her choice is between a commune member we're not really well acquainted with and Christian. Dani picks Christian. The sacrifices are then performed, the cult members scream and cry in solidarity. Dani looks horrified until she doesn't. She smiles in triumph, cathartic music plays. Now for a very, very quick summary of Death Note. So quick, so brief. I'm gonna make it like 3 sentences long. Death Note follows Light Yagami, an exceptionally bright and accomplished high school student who one day finds a mysterious supernatural notebook that was dropped to Earth by the Shinigami Ryuk. The notebook grants him the power to cause anyone's death by just writing down their full name and knowing their face. It is aptly named a Death Note.
There it is! There it is!
Light tests it out.
The suspect has been found dead inside.
And it works. He tests it out again, and it works again. So he immediately contrives a mission that he then wholly dedicates himself to rid the world of all evil by diligently writing down the names of all criminals and outlaws whom he believes the world would be a better place without, and who, in his eyes, don't deserve to be alive. Despite the manner of death that the Death Note defaults to being probably the most inconspicuous cause of death there can be, a heart attack, his killing sprees are so extensive that the unexplainable death of criminals are still linked together by the authorities, and even by the public, who nickname the mysterious arbiter of justice Kira, coming from the word killer. Due to the sheer number of deaths connected to him and the mysterious nature behind his method of killing, Interpol reaches out to an anonymous but accomplished consulting detective known only as L. L's anonymity, the fact that no one knows his name and very few people know what he looks like, is a great asset for him during the investigation, as he quickly deduces that Kira needs a person's name and face to be able to kill them, despite still not knowing what he is actually using to commit the murders. He confirms that theory by setting a trap for Kira on national television and using a death row inmate as bait. Okay, and then like a lot of stuff happens, a bunch of FBI agents die, tapes are sent from Kira, who we then find out is actually an imposter Kira, but that imposter appears more powerful than the original Kira, as they're able to kill people without knowing their names. We quickly discover that the second Kira is popular teen model actress Misa Amani, who obtained a second Death Note from a different Shinigami, Rem. Misa made a deal with Rem where, in exchange for half her lifespan, she gets the Shinigami Eyes, which reveal to her the name and remaining lifespan of everyone she sees. A deal that was previously offered to Light, which he declined. Having the Shinigami Eyes means that the Death Note can be used on anyone whose face Misa can see. Misa is an avid and dedicated supporter of the original Kira, since he punished the men who killed her family, which is something she is clearly very grateful for. So she pulls the attention stunt we meet her through just to get in contact with the original Kira. And then even more things happen, a lot more things. Light gives up the Death Note at some point, and in turn, he loses all his memories of it. The change in his personality is actually really interesting during that period, but it doesn't really fit into the discussion here, so I don't know, just watch the show or read the manga or something. Anyway, turns out it was all actually part of a grand scheme he was concocting, which is pulled off successfully, and it ends with L dying, which is very upsetting. And then Light takes over as L, so now he's both L and Kira, which means Kira is able to continue his mission for years while avoiding capture, since the person in charge of capturing him is literally himself. Crime rates go down, and Kira has entire cults dedicated to him now. Full TV stations dedicated to spreading his message. 3 years later, Mello and Nier, L's successors, separately take over the investigation after being informed of L's death and believing Light to be the prime suspect. Light gets an old flame-turned news reporter to work with him. Don't know why I phrased that like that. And then he kills her, like the gentleman he is. And Mello dies too. Light recruits one of his most avid supporters, Mikami, to take Misa's Death Note and use it as he dictates, which almost works. But it all builds up to a showdown in a warehouse where Light gets caught because of a whole thing where Mikami writes down everyone's names except his into a fake Death Note that Nier had planted, and then Light celebrates and it's obvious because he thinks he took out the entire task force and he won, but he did not win. So Light gets shot, and then he's reduced to groveling and begging for his life, which visibly disillusions Mikami. And then Light turns to Ryuk as a final resort and pleads with him to write the names of the task force members into the Death Note. Ryuk instead writes Light's name in, and then we flash forward and Mikami died too. And at the very end, we see that the cults of Kira are still alive and well. The end. But that was a lot more than 3 sentences. My bad, I tried my best. Okay. Both Midsommar and Death Note have a lurking cult presence that varies in its degree of visibility. They also feature 2 very different kinds of cults, which is why the connection between them may initially seem like a stretch. Or it might still seem like a stretch at the end, I don't know. Both, however, use elements of their storytelling to sell their cults and explain their pull on the characters in the story. And in doing that, they, intentionally or not, end up selling the cults to the viewers as well. The protagonists we follow in both stories are a significant factor in this. So I'm starting with Danny. Danny, the protagonist of Midsommar, who is unknowingly in the middle of her own cult recruitment. A recruitment that ends up being very successful. The cult in Midsommar is fascinating because its cultism in and of itself isn't actually dangerous on a grand scale, and it isn't motivated by an ideology or a lofty goal to impact the world at large. We don't even really see a very prominent cult leader amongst the Harga, like you would with most cults of that nature. Instead, the cult in Midsommar is centered around worshipping a Norse god, and all that entails, and is mainly focused on an intense sense of community rather than an ideological motivation. Even their philosophy on the different stages of life is not that damaging or threatening. There really would be no major issues with them if it wasn't for their occasional murder sprees. All that being said, while we do not get to see someone who is clearly the main cult leader of the Harga, Danny is handled by a surrogate one, Pele. He possesses the charisma and ability to read people and target their weaknesses that makes for an incredibly effective cult recruiter. Pele knows how to draw people to him and how to say exactly what they need to hear to follow him. He is not objectively in charge of the cult itself, as in he's not necessarily your typical Charles Manson, Jim Jones figure. In fact, no one in the cult appears to have a really prominent dictatorial position. That's probably due to the sense of community specifically fostered in the Harga. Their relationship does not appear to be one of hierarchy. Pele still does, however, exhibit a lot of the traits of a traditional cult leader to Danny and to us, which in a way makes this recruitment process a lot more personal, and that's reflected in Danny's indoctrination. Danny's indoctrination felt personally tailored to her and the emotional turmoil she was going through. And that's probably what was most effective to us. The movie is not trying to sell you on an abstract mission or ideal. It's selling you the emotional catharsis this cult is providing the protagonist. Danny goes through harrowing trauma at the beginning of the movie, and it is relayed to us in a way that has an incredible emotional impact, like in this scene.
Hey. Danny. Babe.
And in this scene. These deliver a very intentional gut punch. They knock the wind right out of me because they felt so real. I instantly felt immersed in Danny's pain. Her pain is delivered so unapologetically that it's impossible not to sink into. But for the magnitude of pain we feel during those scenes, we immediately see her repress it. She struggles alone. It looks to us like she only has Christian and he's not much help, to say the least. The way the movie cuts from right after her breakdown to a scene of Christian telling her he's leaving to stop by a party is obviously not temporally sequential in like diegetic timeline in the same way that it's presented to us. These two events do not actually happen consecutively. Why did I write that sentence like that? These two events do not actually happen consecutively, and logically you know that, but the way the movie cuts is not relying on your logic, it relies on your emotions. And emotionally, we just got whiplash. Whiplash that was delivered by Christian specifically. So now we hate him even more, and that's precisely what the movie wants. In an interview, Ari Aster outright states that the movie was designed the way it was to make you want that ending.
There's plenty of it's all kind of designed to really make you want that ending.
This is what he means. The movie is deliberately delivering Danny's emotions to us this way. Deliberately making her pain as tangible as possible. Deliberately plunging us into darkness and pain and sorrow with her. And then deliberately having Christian be the target of our rage because we don't know where else to direct it. Having him be the reason we have to suppress all these emotions instead of working through them. All because he wants to go to a party. And then he wants to go to Sweden. And then he wants to get high. It relies on your emotions, not your rationality, to push you to the point where you want Christian dead. Where, when Danny is given a choice, you're rooting for her catharsis, even when it's at the expense of a comparatively innocent life. Midsommar uses everything a movie can use to get you there. It is specifically designed to put you in a place where you want Danny's catharsis at any cost, and it starts doing that very early on. Danny's incredibly alone from the very beginning of the movie. We get overcome with the sense of solitude and loneliness immediately, and her calls not connecting when she tries to reach her sister adds to that, making us feel further and further detached from any human presence. Even her friend, whom she's on the phone with earlier, is never seen on screen, which feels purposefully done to heighten this sense of isolation. The only people around her who break that are Christian and his friends, people who don't extend Danny the empathy she deserves. They push Danny to suppress her trauma by treating it and her like a burden. There are people who, under different circumstances, we would just view as regular, run-of-the-mill jerks. But under the heightened scrutiny of the emotional trauma the movie plunges you into, they are enraging and totally deserve to be sacrificial offerings in an archaic religious ritual. But amidst all this darkness, loneliness, and dismissal of her trauma, we get a ray of sunshine. Literally, the heavens shine upon them when they step foot in Sweden. It is such a jarring departure from everything we have been submerged in so far that it requires a second to adjust to the change. From the very beginning, this is a place where Danny feels integrated. The trees breathe with her, and the grass grows through her. She is part of something bigger. She is no longer alone and isolated, and immediately we see manifestations of her trauma announce their presence. This is not Danny on drugs. I mean, it is, but that's not what it means. Danny has been suppressing her pain all along, and now that the sense of isolation is slowly breaking, her trauma begins to make its presence known, encouraging her to work through it rather than continue to suppress it. And that continues. The Harga continues to break down everything that caused Danny to suppress her trauma. Even the horrific death ritual she witnesses contributes to that, as it gets her to view death from a different angle. During the nightmare sequence, we see that being abandoned by Christian and their friends is literally Danny's biggest fear at the moment. She's terrified of being left behind, of being alone. She had already experienced heavy loss when her entire family was ripped from her instantly, so her fear of abandonment is incredibly justified. We see why she does everything she can to hold on to what she has. She pushes her pain away and pretends that she's fine, so she doesn't become a burden and doesn't get abandoned. But the Harga allows her to break away from that completely. This is a different world. A better world. We even see that shift visually as they enter the compound. This is a new world where Danny's allowed to be in pain and to show it. And she doesn't have to endure it alone. When she dances, they dance with her. When she screams, they scream with her. The Harga share all their pain. And Danny desperately needs to share all this pain she has been bottling up with someone. So it's cathartic when Danny chooses to cut ties with the world that made her hide her trauma and suffer in silence. It's cathartic when she chooses Christian for the sacrifice. It's cathartic when she smiles at a moment of triumphant exuberance. Finally. Except, is it?
There's people that are dying.
No, obviously not. The movie makes you think that it is, and I remember leaving the movie thinking, "Oh, that was such a nice ending." And then you remove yourself from the emotional state the film puts you in, and just like think about it for a minute. And it's like, what's wrong with you? You get sad for 90 minutes, and suddenly you can excuse murder. See, I wrote that down, and I don't know how to deliver that line naturally, so we're just gonna go with it. And that was when I realized that the movie kind of broke my moral compass. And I had to think about the fact that I probably would fall for a cult if they knew how and when to target me. And this cult just knew how to target me. Nothing, absolutely nothing that Christian and his friends do deserves death. In fact, I would argue that very few things people do are worthy of death. And whether you believe in capital punishment or not, being a bad boyfriend, being an apathetic jerk, and cheating are not capital punishment offenses. But the movie gets us there, or at least it got me there. It brings us to this point where we see our protagonist choose capital punishment as a repercussion for those offenses, and we still kind of cheer for it. I cheered for it. It's because when Danny is at her most emotionally vulnerable, this is taken advantage of. By the cult, by the movie. In an article published by the New York Times titled "The Psychology of the Cult Experience," Dr. John G. Clark Jr. states that a typical manipulated conversion involves a vulnerable person, a student leaving home, or at exam time, or someone who has lost a friend or a lover, who is enticed by some reward, companionship, peace of mind, etc. Danny fits all of these criteria, and in the scene following the death ritual, we see Pele pounce on the opportunity. In the scene right before this, Danny's anxiety had been building, and as the movie tends to do in scenes with intense emotional impact, we are placed directly in her shoes during it. Our anxiety builds as hers does. The music stops when she makes eye contact with the woman on the cliff, making the world go silent for us the moment it goes silent for her. The sound gets muted and fades out for us when she's in shock, disorienting us right alongside her. So while we are all in the state of heightened anxiety and panic, while we are confused and trying to cope, Pele steps in and confuses us even more.
I know what you're going through, Danny.
Pele offers Danny exactly what he knows she needs and has been deprived of. The cult praises Pele for being able to read people, and he uses that talent to its full extent on Danny in this scene.
My parents, they burned up in a fire, and I became technically an orphan. So believe me when I tell you that I know what it's like, because I really, really do. Yet my difference is I never got the chance to feel lost, because I had a family here, where everyone embraced me, and I was raised by a community that doesn't bicker over what's theirs and what's not theirs. That's what you were given. But I have always felt held by a family, a real family, which everyone deserves. And you deserve it.
He knows what she needs is people. A community to belong to, one that would allow her to feel her loss without being alone. He even delivers a perfect hit by referencing his own trauma of losing his family, and how he was not adversely affected by the loss because he had this close community behind him, which immediately conjures up a comparison between his experience and what Danny has been going through. Suppressing her emotions and feeling all alone and terrified of being abandoned anytime she crosses an imaginary line, and constantly worrying that her feelings and her pain will become too much for Christian. And then Pele goes in for the kill. He targets the only, albeit flimsy, rope Danny has been holding on to. He aims directly for Christian.
Danny, do you feel held by him? Does he feel like home to you?
In one sentence, Pele tears at the one thing that had been keeping Danny tethered to her community, her society, their norms, their social ideas, their morals. He chose the exact moment her vulnerability was at its height and lit the match that would sever the last thing keeping her from completely surrendering to the Harga. And in our shared state of heightened emotions and confusion, everything he says makes perfect sense to us too. And we get a similar experience of being placed in Danny's shoes when she's crowned May Queen, but like in the opposite emotional direction. Danny wins, she gets love bomb, and like she's finally getting all this love and support she's been deprived of for so long. And the audience gets to experience that with her. After being isolated for so long, we are overwhelmed by the people surrounding us while we are in her shoes. We even see Danny's mother at the same time Danny sees her, and it feels like a moment of divine approval. It's Danny finally finding a family to replace the one she lost. And who are we to deny her that? Who are we to rain on her parade and tell her it's actually based on moral transgressions and murder? In an interview with Vox about Midsommar, Ari Aster makes a statement that I found really interesting. He says he never viewed the Harga as a cult. So I looked up what a cult is defined as academically, just out of curiosity. And while scholars are kind of vague about this, here is one definition I found in a peer-reviewed academic journal. A cult is usually defined as a small, informal group lacking a definite authority structure, somewhat spontaneous in its development, although often possessing a somewhat charismatic leader or group of leaders, and deriving its inspiration and ideology from outside the predominant religious culture. If dominant cultural values are individualistic rational, as some would say about modern American society, then cultic responses could be the hippie subculture and the religious commune. Of all the cults mentioned earlier, and even the one I'm discussing next, no cult fits this specific definition better than the Harga. So, no, I never saw them as a cult. They might be, but I never called them a cult. For me, they are a community and they are a family. It's objectively inaccurate. But you know what it does sound like? It sounds like something that someone who is trying to get you to join the fictional cult they created would say. In contrast with the Harga, the cult in Death Note is entirely centered around ideology and enacting changes in the world, with the ultimate goal of creating a utopia. It reflects the rise of the Doomsday cult in every sense, and that is not an accident. In 1987, Shoko Asahara founded the now infamous Doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo. In 1995, Aum Shinrikyo carried out a series of deadly sarin gas attacks on the subways of Tokyo. According to Robert J. Lifton in his book Losing Reality, a third Aum characteristic was its ideology of killing to heal, of altruistic murder and altruistic world destruction.
This world is rotting, and those who are making it rot deserve to die.
This altruistic mass murder depended in turn on a fourth characteristic, the relentless impulse toward world-rejecting purification.
世の中を悪のない理想の世界に変えるんだ。時間はいくらあっても足りない。
The deadly sarin attacks of 1995 provoked a lot of conversation regarding anime and manga, since Asahara was known to be an avid fan of both. In reaction to the scrutiny the medium was subjected to, mangakas featured responses to Aum's existence in their art and in their stories. As stated in the 2012 paper Manga After Aum from the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies, which I will be borrowing from a lot for this section of the video, many manga that were published during the period of high alert that followed the Aum affair exhibited fascination with marginal religious groups as evil cults, populated by gullible followers and headed by fiendish charlatans. Continuing, such manga became more nuanced in their analyses of marginal religions as the Aum incident grew historically distant, and the evil cult trope became increasingly sophisticated as the author-artists acknowledged that Aum represented general human tendencies, rather than aberrant psychotic behavior. So it's evident that the existence of the cult in Death Note and the concept of a charismatic leader in possession of a weapon of mass destruction, hell-bent on purifying the world through death and demolition, does not exist in a vacuum and is influenced by real life, as all art tends to be. Knowing the circumstances and the cultural zeitgeist Death Note was created in allows us to view the decisions that were made in terms of storytelling and the portrayal of Light and his cult within the appropriate context. While present in the background, the cult in Death Note does not take the front seat, except for maybe the last few pages of the manga. We'll get to them in a minute. The central plot of Death Note's storyline is always the cat and mouse chase between Light and whoever is trying to catch him, and it's what keeps the story exciting. But this is specifically about the cult, so I'm gonna be zeroing in on that. One of the more interesting aspects of the exploration of the cult in Death Note is the focus on two fairly important characters who fell for the cult tactics. The way we are provided with their backstories and their motivations allows us to see that little vulnerabilities, small experiences that alter your biases and shape your view of the world, can have such a significant impact on how you view moral transgressions and what you're willing to justify in the name of cleansing the world of what once caused you a deep emotional wound. Misa Misa is one of the core main characters in Death Note. As previously mentioned, she was the second Kira and she's instrumental in many of Light's plans. We meet Misa in episode 11 when she's like murdering quite a few innocent people to get Kira's attention. She wants that because she's an avid Kira supporter and she feels immense gratitude towards him. However, Misa's not really vilified, despite how awful the things she does right from the start are. She's not painted as a ruthless and psychopathic counterpart to Light in her demeanor, or in how she carries herself. She's actually kind of cute, and she's charming a lot of the time. I don't necessarily like Misa as a character, because of the actual way she's written, but in terms of how she's portrayed in a light that skews fairly positive. Part of that could have been due to the protagonist and the point of view we're consuming the story from, but no, Light is a massive dick to her. And he doesn't like her most of the time, and he seems to only really tolerate her because she has the Shinigami eyes, and the other notebook, and she's useful to his plans. So it's not the point of view, it's not the protagonist. But we get Misa's backstory, and we learn that Misa's family was murdered and the justice system failed to get her justice. But Kira took out the criminals who killed her family and delivered her the justice she needed to feel a sense of closure. And there it is, we have a very human, almost relatable motivation. One that could happen to any of us, and it almost adequately explains her blind devotion to a mass murderer. That's what Death Note does extremely effectively, regarding its portrayal of hopelessly devoted cult members willing to kill for the leader they follow and worship. I kinda get it. They make you get it. This brings us to the second subject, Mikami. I don't necessarily get Mikami the same way I get Misa, but his presence is very interesting because he portrays another, less talked about stage of the blind devotion, the reckoning, the realization that the being you've been worshipping is not a god at all. He's nothing but a man. We also get Mikami's backstory, and while I don't find it particularly relatable on a personal level, I'm not going to generalize and assume that just because something doesn't resonate with me, then it won't resonate with someone else. That approach contributes to the level of removal and disconnect from others that allows us to distance ourselves from the tragedies that happen around us. Mikami's backstory illustrates his obsession with justice. His motivations actually appear pretty altruistic. He does not seem to be driven by the usual evils like the need for money, the need for power, the need for control. Mikami just wants justice. The problem is that he wants it in a very extreme manner. He deletes people whom he perceives as less than perfect beings. This is why his thinking and views on the purification of the world are already predisposed to line up with Kira's, and why he becomes such an avid and devoted supporter. I don't think Light could have picked a more suited person for the role he gave him. Mikami was perfect because he genuinely profoundly believed in the mission itself, which is why watching his world crumble around him when he's confronted with the reality that Light is nothing but a malignant narcissist with a god complex is fascinating. Towards the demise of the group, as Asahara's control over his environment faltered, his megalomania ceased to be functional. Threats from the outside, groups contesting arms activities and the developing police investigation of its murders, and from the inside, undermined the shared fantasy so necessary to the workings of such megalomania. The guru's intensified paranoia drove him toward external violence as well as toward various forms of self-destruction, and he became more extreme and fragmented. I don't really know what finally did it for Mikami. I'm actually gonna say that I don't know if anything actually did do it for Mikami. I don't know if seeing the manic megalomania face to face, or Light spinelessly throwing Mikami under the bus when he got caught, or just everything coming together kind of was eye-opening to him. I'm not sure what the final straw was, but witnessing his gods fall from grace and being confronted with the reality of the person he did all these things for and put all his faith into, it all leads to this. This is a significant discrepancy between the anime and the manga because Mikami's death in the anime is so dramatic. There's screaming, there's blood spraying everywhere, bonkers. And I actually don't know if it was him just giving up or if it was him giving Light an out by distracting everyone. But Mikami in the manga does none of that. Not just the lack of dramatics, the lack of anything. Mikami does not kill himself in the manga. Instead, we get to see a toned-down but accurate representation of a man just being disillusioned with the god he worshipped as he finally looks at him from up close. And then we get his fate relate to us after a time jump, where Matsuda is convinced that Nier wrote Mikami's name in the notebook to control his actions for the days leading up to the warehouse showdown. It kind of feels like it adds like an odd characterization to Nier. And I still think it adds a murky air to the ending confrontation scene, but like not in a bad way. The moral ambiguity of it works well within the tone of the story overall. Another character's fate that is changed in the adaptation is Misa's. In the manga, we get no update on her. She's not even brought up in the flash forward or anything. In the anime, however, we actually see her sitting on the edge of a tower, with the less than subtle implication being that she takes her own life. There are obviously other discrepancies between the adaptation and the source material, but these two always stood out to me because they feel almost deliberate. I'm not sure what the reasoning behind the change was. I had like a whole section speculating about that, but I scrapped it because it was just guessing. Whatever the reason was, the end result is that the two characters most prominently dedicated to light, the ones we got to know the most, end up taking their own lives when their god is inevitably brought down, which is just something I found interesting. Another difference between the anime and the manga is the final 7 pages of the final volume of the manga, because in the source material, the main storyline doesn't actually end with Light dying. The story ends on a more haunting note. I thought for a long time about why, after 12 whole volumes, this is the specific imagery the story closes on. At the time, I hadn't thought of Kira's devotees as an outright cult. The story has so much else going on that there isn't much time to focus on that. The idea was obviously there in the back of my mind, but those last few pages were what made me go back and reread the manga with this specific concept in mind. It's a very specific message to leave us with, that even in his death, someone like Light is still left with so many followers. He may be dead, but his presence and mission are not. And while that could prompt us to wonder what's wrong with the people still dedicated to him, after looking at Misa and Mikami, I think our curiosity should be regarding the stories of the people still supporting him. And to some, the idea of Light having dedicated followers is actually not shocking or confusing at all. You see, the thing about Death Note is, Light is not the antagonist. So we have actual real-life debates about Team L or Team Light, which automatically means that there is a Team Light in real life. So the concept of Kira continuing to have followers and Light dying but the cult surviving is in no way a foreign concept. It's literally what the narrative does in real life. So how did the narrative sell us Light? How did it recruit people to Team Light despite making it clear that his actions are morally reprehensible? Despite the fact that we spend the whole narrative close enough to see his follies and his flaws, we're even closer than Mikami was when reality hit him in the face. The first thing to acknowledge is that everything the narrative does will be perceived differently depending on individual worldviews. And just like I recognized that I definitely fell for the indoctrination of Midsommar and allowed my moral judgment to skew in favor of my emotional bias, I think the same applies for anyone who fell for Kira's indoctrination. We all have experiences that bias us towards certain viewpoints and are like an Achilles heel in our moral fortitude. And that's normal. It's human. Like in Midsommar, the protagonist is the most significant aspect of Death Note's indoctrination. But it's also kind of really different from Midsommar. While Midsommar presents Danny in an incredibly sympathetic light and places you right in her shoes often, Death Note does not do that. As stated in manga after Takeshi Obata, who renders Death Note in stark strokes characterized fittingly by a complex interplay of light and shadow. Although his peers recognize him as intelligent, athletic, and extremely attractive by all standards, Light's face seems haunted and can easily become eerily twisted. And the anime takes this even one step further, making Light's eyes literally turn red whenever he's on a murder spree. There is not a single more ominous character design choice they could have gone with. It seems like everything they could do to deter you from siding with Light, they did. Except for the most important thing. They still let him tell his story. You see, when people do bad things, it's often not just for the sake of being evil. Well, sometimes it is, but not with people like Light. Light believes he is justice. He won't shut up about it.
You think I'm evil? I am justice! I protect the innocent and those who fear evil. I'm the one who will become the god of a new world that everyone desires.
Allowing him to speak to the audience so much, as he is the story's protagonist, allows us to get his justifications for the things he does. It allows us to view the world from his point of view. People are usually able to justify the things they do to themselves. And with someone as clever as Light, his justifications to himself are actually good.
Who am I to pass judgment on others? No, wait. Maybe I'm wrong. This is exactly what I've been thinking about lately. This world is rotting, and those who are making it rot deserve to die. Someone has to do it, so why not me? Even if it means sacrificing my own mind and soul, it's worth it. Because the world can't go on like this.
Back to the Thomas study, he says, Oba and Obata do a masterful job of inviting readers to imaginatively identify with light, even if they recognize that his vision of justice is impure and that his supercilious attempt to save society from itself is both self-aggrandizing and cruel.
And I will become the god of this new world.
And that's what it is. Light is not surrounded by flowers. He doesn't smile for the camera to make us root for his happiness at the expense of rational morality.
If I'm serious about trying to create an ideal world that's free from evil, then I need to make the most of my time.
It meant that the world could be seen as so hopelessly polluted, so suffused with evil, as to preclude half measures. No truth was more central to Om than the principle that world salvation could be achieved only by bringing about the death of just about everyone on this earth. Light is painted as the killer he is, but Kira's indoctrination is more about the mission, and his mission is presented and explained to us as thoroughly as possible by the most biased source, Light himself. And if he can convince someone as smart as him that his killings are justified, why wouldn't others fall for it too? Death Note darkly suggests that the will to security can come at the expense of conventional morality, and that people will perpetually find ways to sanctify and legitimize horrific acts of violence. Like Urasawa's story, the manga invites readers into the disturbing recognition that laudable moral ideals easily become warped. Rather than reducing cult membership to delusion, Death Note instead attributes the cultic adulation of Kira to people's interest in the creation of an impossibly perfect world. The price of peace is death. So, what was the point of all this anyway? Honestly, I don't know. Sometimes I just have thoughts, and then I Google things out of curiosity, and then before I realize it, I've wasted 2 hours reading articles, and I need to push that onto someone. And I think my roommate's really getting sick of being that someone, so I'm just releasing it into the wild. But if I were to explain why I tried to link these two stories together, despite them having nothing in common besides a mild cult presence and the fact that I like them both, I think it was just an attempt at understanding. Just what I opened with in the intro. We distance ourselves from bad things, hoping that if we put enough space between us and the people they happen to, we'll be protected by this bubble of denial. And I just think that leads to more harm than good. It leads to more of us not noticing the things happening to us until it's too late. Like I said earlier, denying things doesn't make them any less true. And acknowledging that the tendencies that affect people's judgment and may lead them to dire situations are present in all of us is vital to preventing them from happening. I also think that fiction and stories are some of the best ways to gain insight into many of our collective proclivities that are hard to demonstrate anywhere else. Our ability to tell stories, perceive things that we can't see, and believe in things that we cannot touch are all innate parts of being human. They are all parts of the fabric of what makes us unique as a species, but they are also what makes us vulnerable. Humans can perceive things on such a grand scale that we long so desperately for something to believe in. We need something bigger than us, a higher purpose, and that's what makes us vulnerable to all this. It's also why none of us are immune. We all long for something. Maybe it's a sense of purpose, maybe it's justice, maybe it's a mission, maybe it's somewhere to belong. Maybe it's a place to share your pain. We all have something that presides in the back of our brain that we've convinced ourselves is all we're lacking. That once we have it, we'll be complete. And if someone persuades you that they have that one thing, it has a way of skewing your innate moral compass, the things you think are okay, and the things you're willing to justify.